Hello, YouTube, and welcome back to another book review from me, your host, Logan Albright. You know, I often wonder to myself why some countries have kind of rich novel traditions and other countries don't seem to. For example, there are many great novels from France. I can think of a lot of them that are just brilliant and celebrated and taught in high school curriculums and college curriculums all over the United States. There's many great Russian novels. There's a handful of celebrated German novels, although not as many. Lots of British, lots of American novels. But you don't hear very many Italian novels, for example. So why does Italy not have a very strong novel writing culture compared to France, which is right next door, or Russia or any of these other countries? I think that's interesting. And one of the other countries, which you don't really think about having a rich novel writing culture, is Australia. And this week I read a book from Australia that I knew absolutely nothing about. I picked up on a wild hunch in a used bookstore with no information about it. And I learned a lot, and I want to talk about it. And the book is Ultima Thule, or Ultima Thule, depending on how you want to pronounce it, by Henry Handel Richardson, which is a pseudonym for a female writer. And it turns out this is actually the third book in a series called The Fortunes of Richard Mahoney, third and final book. And so I read the third part of it without having read the first two parts, which may have colored my understanding or enjoyment of it, but I don't think it really did that much. So I want to talk about it a little bit. First of all, the title is the reason I picked it up. The title is a concept from kind of ancient Greece, which referred to a extreme, remote northern island kind of beyond the reaches of the known world. And I thought that's an interesting concept, and it sounded appealing to me, and it's been used in later media. I've heard it referenced in a song by Yes, for example. The Thule Society is famously a cult society that predated the Nazis. So it's been a concept that's been used in a lot of different ways, usually has mystical connotations, and I'm interested in mysticism. So I thought that would be interesting. I was completely wrong about that, because the book has nothing to do with mysticism or the far north or anything Greek mythology or anything like that. It's a fairly domestic drama taking place in Australia. And what it's about is this guy, Richard Mahoney, who moves to Australia with his wife and several children, and has found that he's lost all his money. His fortunes are ruined. He invested unwisely with some unscrupulous people, and he basically has to start from scratch. He's a doctor. And I have here, this is the first American edition, published in 1929, so that's kind of cool. Sort of an old book. And I just read it completely blind. And I have to say, I didn't love it. I found it kind of depressing, and I found it kind of boring. And again, I have to apologize for not having read the first two volumes. I may not be fully appreciating it, but I'll tell you what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it. Richard Mahoney, as I said, is a doctor, and throughout the novel, by the way, spoilers in case you haven't read this, so I'm going to get into some of the things that happen in it. He basically is trying unsuccessfully to build up his practice and kind of restores some money. But he makes some very unwise decisions. He goes into debt to build a house for him and his family to live in, and then he's just saddled with this debt for the rest of the novel and can never really get out from under it, can never really make any significant amount of money as a doctor. And he's getting old, and he's becoming less effective, and he's gradually kind of gripped by some kind of a disease that is kind of affecting his mental faculties and his emotional mood swings and his physical capabilities, and he's basically deteriorating at a rapid rate. I found him a very unpleasant character. He's constantly yelling at his wife and flying off the handle and keeping secrets from her. He just isn't a very nice guy, and maybe you like grow to love him in the early books, and then you start to fall off with that as he starts to deteriorate mentally, and you feel more sympathy for him. I mean, it is a very sad thing to happen to anyone, but I didn't find him incredibly sympathetic. And much of the early part of the novel is kind of very mundane, domestic life, it actually reminded me a little of something like Little Women, but Little Women is far more compelling, has much more likable characters, much more interesting things happening in it. But it's very domestic in that sense. It's about him and his wife's life, trying to get out from the burden of debt and raising their children. The wife I didn't love either. I didn't find her particularly likable. There's one scene where one of their children is discovered to have quite great musical ability. He has perfect pitch, and this visiting baron is like, this guy has real potential to be a really master musician. Let me take him away, and I'll pay for his education, and we'll get him trained up as a professional musician. Can't talk. And the wife is like, no, I don't want to do that. And so it's just that thread ends right there. And she's kind of, harsh about it, which it seemed like a real potential, especially given that the expenses were going to be taken care of. And she's always angry and resentful at her husband for having squandered their money, which is understandable, but doesn't make for very happy reading of this couple who's really struggling with each other. And as he gets worse and worse off, she has to take on more and more responsibilities for herself. And it's all very unpleasant and kind of bitter and kind of depressing. Like I said, nothing mystical about it. It's just about Australia. The author is Australian, and this novel actually won a prize for being one of the best novels in Australia of that year. I forget the name of the prize, but it was award-winning, and it's the third volume in the series, and the whole thing was then repackaged as The Fortunes of Richard Mahoney, and it's fairly well acclaimed. Despite the fact that I didn't particularly enjoy it or have a good time reading it, I do have to admit that it is pretty well written. I had a struggle trying to decide how to rate this book on Goodreads because it's technically proficient. Like the writing is good, the prose is good. It's just I wasn't that interested in the subject matter. I didn't like the characters that much. I did find the descent into madness pretty interesting. I like that kind of stuff. I find it kind of human psychology very fascinating. And this is one of the first kind of literary depictions of someone really losing their mind. And so that was really interesting, and I liked that. But it was so depressing that I had a hard time enjoying it. And ultimately, I felt I had to rate the book based on how much I got out of it and how much I enjoyed it, rather than how technically good it is. So if you are someone who likes really kind of slow-paced domestic dramas that are just about everyday life and about people, you might enjoy this book and this book series. But I found it too slow, too overly detailed, and without characters that I could really relate to. So I didn't really enjoy it. But, you got to take a chance every once in a while and try a book that you just don't know anything about and see if it's good. It was only a few dollars in the used bookstore, and I advocate doing that. I like doing that, and I advocate doing that. Browse used bookstores and pick up stuff that looks interesting, and you might find a hidden gem, or you might find something that isn't particularly good. So you never know. But this was at one point very popular, so I'm glad that I read it. I really don't have much more to say about it than that. It's the first Australian novel I've ever read. So that's interesting. It's interesting to see what the Australian tradition is like. I've recently been watching a lot more Australian cinema, and I have to say I'm not super impressed with Australian cinema either. So maybe that continent or that country still has a ways to go in terms of perfecting their art forms. But it's interesting to read stuff from other parts of the world, and so that's fun. It has kind of an English flair to it, but it's definitely not English. It's got that colonial English. It's English spin-off sort of thing. So that was my thoughts on Ultima Thule. Wouldn't really recommend unless you have a particular interest in that sort of a book. But I don't know who would have a particular interest in that sort of a book. It feels very much of its time. I feel like it hasn't aged all that well. And I realize there's a little bit of an irony in me saying that, because I always complain about people saying that books haven't aged well. Because I think a good book is a good book regardless of the time. But this really does feel like a little bit too slow and too stuffy for the modern era. And that's what I thought of it. So let me know what you thought. If you have read this series in the past, if you know anything about the author or anything else that she wrote, I'd be interested to hear if you've read this book. Leave me comments down below. And of course, if you enjoyed the review, please like the video and subscribe to the channel and click the bell for notifications. In the meantime, I'll be back next week with another book review for you. Hopefully something I enjoyed more, and we'll check back in then. Thanks so much for watching. I've been your host, Logan Albright, and I'll catch you next time.